Over the years I've made tons of different vampire crab ecosystems, all of which you can find here on the channel. However, in this video I'm going to be doing something completely different. I'm going to be building a massive high-tech spray foam free, mostly organic, vertical style vampire crab ecosystem, and I'm going to be building it in an Exoterra 45 by 45 by 90 terrarium. The project is going to be home to a rare type of arboreal Geosesarma vampire crab species that molts on land and spends more time off the ground and up in the canopy. The tech. The tank is an Exoterra small extra tall 45 by 45 by 90 terrarium, along with the Exoterra 45 by 45 by 70 cabinet. The light I'm using is a Syncore Optima 30cm WRB app controlled light, which pumps out the perfect amount of light for this tank size. For heating, I'm using a generic heat mat for this build, which I'm placing underneath the tank as there's adequate ventilation space, allowing for it to breathe safely. For temperature and humidity control, I'm using a generic temperature controller connected to a do-it-yourself fan system, which is configured in a push-pull formation. I'm also using a fogger, and this is the last piece of equipment in the tank. It's an Exoterra fogger, which turns on twice a day for 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the afternoon. I'm also adding a small waterfall, which you'll see a little later on in the video. As I'm trying to keep this vampire crab paludarium as organic as possible, I'm not going to be using any spray foam, and instead I've opted to use some pressed Corkboards. This stuff is basically just cork and charcoal pressed into sheets, but you can also use plain corkboard without the charcoal if this stuff is more available to you. This tank is going to be the centerpiece for my animal room, so it's going to be viewable from 3 primary sides. So rather than sticking the boards on the back of the tank, I've laid the tank on its side and I'm placing the boards on a different panel. If you were paying attention earlier in the video, this will make perfect sense. Before doing any gluing, I'm sizing things up to make sure I can fit the panels to the size properly. And the white plastic box section that's in the middle, I'm going to be using that to route my waterfall tubing and the power cable for the pump. The plan is to have a small pool at the top of the tank so the crabs can have multiple places to access water in their environment. And now that I know everything is going to fit properly, I'm just going to glue it all down with some silicone. Unfortunately, there aren't any real silicone alternatives that I can find that are organic. So this is one of the few elements in this build that isn't going to be natural. If you do have a great alternative, I'm happy to hear about it. As soon as I've glued everything down, I'm going to be putting as much heavy stuff as I could find on top of it for about 12 hours or so, just to make sure it sticks properly. Then after the glue has set, I'm going to be adding some more cork panels over the box section in the middle to hide it so it doesn't look so obvious. For this, I'm just using some bison glue. In other countries, it's probably called Gorilla Glue. And I also made sure while doing this to keep the box section free moving, just in case I need to make some changes later on. For the final stage of gluing, I'm just sticking random bits of corkboard all over the background just to make it look really random, as this is what everything else in the tank is going to be mounted to. And here's what it looks like a couple of days later after everything is dried and I've moved the tank back into its final position. The background is 72 centimeters long and the remaining space is going to be filled with land and water. Moving on to the pump and the waterfall, this is all pretty straightforward. Pump will sit in a small filter box at the bottom of the tank. I just use some scrap acrylic. I reuse this stuff quite often, so it's going to be used in other projects down the track. Now that I know the pump system for the waterfall is going to work, I'm going to start detailing the cork for the background. So for this, I'm just using my Dremel. You can use a fork or something to scrape it back, whatever you like, but I found a Dremel works really well using any of the default sanding bits. Just make sure you have a dust mask and a vacuum cleaner for this because it gets super messy and you don't want to be inhaling tons of cork dust. I actually found this entire part of the process really enjoyable, but it was really messy and it did take quite a long time to get exactly how I wanted it. But I think it turned out pretty good, and it's a hell of a lot nicer than working with spray foams. Normally I leave adding the water section substrate until last, but this time around, in order to avoid using some kind of plastic or glass protection, I'm going to be adding quite a thick layer of sand first. The rocks I'm using have quite pointy and sharp edges, so I don't want to create any pressure points on the glass that may cause things to crack. And when adding the sand layer, I'm just going to be keeping it in the area that I'm going to be working with the rock. As with all of my builds, I'll be making a rock wall next to hold back the substrate layer for the land section. I'm using maple stone for something a little bit different. It's fairly lightweight and has a ton of interesting texture, and this part of the build took quite a few hours over a couple of days to get it just how I wanted it. As this will be one of the main features of the tank, I wanted to make sure it was perfect. I recently made an Iwagumi aquascape using the same stone, which you can check out later if you like. And behind this rock wall barrier, I'm going to be adding clay balls or leca. While you can use lava rock or coarse gravel for this process, I generally prefer using lacquer because it's light and inexpensive to buy. And this build's going to be quite heavy already, so I didn't want to make it any more heavier than it needed to be. I'll be building this substrate layer up about 1 inch to 5 centimeters above the maximum water line that I intend to fill the tank to. On top of this layer, I'll be adding some weed matting. I had thought about using some organic fiber for this, some kind of hemp or natural cotton material, but to be honest, I couldn't find anything suitable around here. I've been using the same sheets of weed matting for a few years now, so I might as well just keep using it. It seems to last forever, so I can probably keep using this for a very long time anyway. At the top of the tank, I want a small pool of water so the crabs have a place to hydrate, as well as the bottom and the middle. To make this work, I'm using a half pot silicon to some more scrap acrylic. I wanted to use a real half terracotta pot for this, and I did try it, but I couldn't find something that fit this exact space. Everything was either way too big or way too small. Now I'm just going to glue it to the top back of the tank using some more Gorilla Glue and then leaving it clamped overnight. Once the glue is dried, I removed the clamps, then covered the entire thing with corkboard scraps to hide the ugly orange terracotta look. Again, if you use some natural clay pottery, you wouldn't need to do this step and it would look a lot better. Bamboo skewers also work exceptionally well to hold things into place while you wait for glue to dry, and in a lot of cases you can actually just use the bamboo skewers without the glue at all, which is what I'm going to be using for some of the steps coming up. Continuing on, I'm now at the point where I can add the bulk of my background material to the corkboard, and I ordered 4 kilos of assorted cork bark bits for this, and I'm going to skewer them into place using the same method as I just showed you. Just this time, I'm not going to be using any glue. Unlike skewering to the corkboards though, this stuff is quite hard, so you'll need to pre-drill some small holes for the skewers to slide through. Most pieces can be held in place with 3 to 4 skewers, but you can add as many as you like to get things to fit nice and securely. I also find adding them at different angles will lock things into place a lot better than putting them all in straight. Whilst doing this, I'm also incorporating my planned waterfall flow path, so it's going to be flowing through some of the cork pieces until it reaches the bottom of the tank. I'm also adding a lot of empty pockets here, which are going to be filled with soil. This is a super important part of the build, which you'll see as things progress a little further on. After this, I filled the tank and tested the waterfall's flow path. It was surprisingly good for the first guesstimate, but it took hours and hours and hours of fine tuning in order to get it to stay within the path I wanted. So I had to move things around a little bit until I got the flow path contained within the cork path. Once it was 90% contained, I proceeded to trim the excess skewers off and move on to the next stage. In all honesty though, getting the waterfall to flow where it should was the hardest part of this entire build. So if you don't need a waterfall and you don't want maintenance down the track, I highly suggest just skipping it and adding a few self-contained pools in stages along the way down. Before adding any moss and plants, I'm going to be covering the bulk of the background with a layer of clay to make things a little bit more natural. I'm not 100% sure what type of clay this is, but I ordered it from a local terrarium store, so I definitely know it's animal safe. I didn't record too much of this process as it was a total nightmare trying to move the camera around while my hands were completely covered in clay, but the process is super simple. Just spray down the surface with a little bit of water, then apply the clay over the top. One thing when making the clay, try to make sure it's not too wet because it gets a little bit tricky to work with. On top of the clay layer, I added quite a bit of hypnum moss, which is one of the primary ingredients to make any tank look really good. I generally only use hypnum moss these days because the other stuff is a little bit more sensitive and it doesn't generally grow as well, but hypnum moss seems to survive pretty much anything. So it's definitely a really good species to work with if you're new to this kind of thing. With moss in place, I added soil to the tank to prepare for the planting stage. As always, I'm just using an organic potting mix for this. There's no need to use any fancy soil mixes. It's a waste of money and time as well as effort. So unless you have really specific plants that require some kind of a mix, just avoid using anything fancy. The soil will be a couple of inches deep in the deepest spots, and I'm also going to be making sure to add soil to all of the soil pockets that I created earlier. Before I add any plants to this, I'm going to be adding some Marcgravia trimmings, followed by an assortment of hollow logs, bark and branches. Just some stuff I found in the forest. I'm also making sure not to cover the pump cover with any soil, and I'm just going to place a piece of bark over it just to make it a little less drama to access it when I need to. Next comes the first round of plants. I'm going to be slowly adding plants to this build over a couple of months as I find the ones that I'm looking for. And I was also lucky enough to have a lovely lady here in Poland send me a box of trimmings from her own vampire crab ecosystem, which I'm super grateful for, though I don't know the names of half of them. As soon as I finished planting everything, I tested the waterfall to make sure I didn't mess up the flow path, and so far it seems to be unchanged. In the second round of planting, I ended up transplanting some big staghorns from my sci-fi tank into this one. They looked fantastic at first, but for some reason they had an insane amount of meltback, and I ended up losing the biggest one, which was a bit of a shame. After adding all of the plants in, I added a little layer of leaf litter to the bottom of the tank, just a random mix of elm, beech and oak leaves. This is a really important step and it makes the tank look a lot more natural. A few weeks later I started working on the water section, and because the crab species I've picked for this tank doesn't really use the water section all that much, I'm just going to be keeping it really simple with a few crypts and some Salvinia. Later on I also decided to add a spare tiger lotus that I had, which came out of another tank, but I think that might get a little bit too big for this one. After another month I finally got the chance to collect a little more hardscape, so I spent even more time than I'd like to admit trying to fit it into the tank. Some of the pieces were amazing, but a little bit too big, so I had to trim them down and break them up until I got them to fit and positioned exactly where I wanted them. Working from the side like this was also a bit of a nightmare, because I had to do everything sideways instead of just placing it in from the front, which is a hell of a lot easier. To add this stuff to the tank, I just used a skewer method, the bigger bits, and for some of the smaller, more awkward ones, I did end up having to use some super glue to keep them in place. Round 3 of planting, I added a mini orchid to the tank to add some more colour, but the flower didn't last too long, though it seems to be doing quite well so far. I also added a couple of small ferns and a heap more creeping plants. And the last thing and final thing to go into this tank before the crabs arrive in a few months is going to be isopods. And rather than adding some fancy isopods, I've decided to go with some wild types. I've been breeding these here for a few months, specifically for this tank, as I wanted to keep things fairly natural, and these seem like a really good choice. And on the same day that I added the isopods, I spotted an army of little mushrooms popping up all over the tank, which is a really good sign things are maturing well. After leaving the tank to mature for quite a while, it's finally time to add some vampire crabs. This particular species is called Geosesarma notiforum, or white mandarin. They are one of the few species of vampire crab that actually benefits greatly from being in a vertical style tank, which is why I've chosen them particularly for this ecosystem. Unlike most other Geosesarma species, they also molt on land and don't visit the water section all that often. Unfortunately though, they are also one of the most delicate species to keep, and they ship even worse than most other Geosesarma species, which already ship really bad in the first place. Thankfully, I was lucky enough that my friend Rick in Germany could get me some of these, and to avoid shipping, we made a 16-hour round trip by car to ensure their safe arrival in their new home. If you speak German, check out his channel sometime. He's got quite a lot of vampire crab videos, with plenty more on the way. For this video, I won't go into tons more detail on this particular species of vampire crab, or we'll be here all day, but you can find a full species profile for them and plenty of others on my website. In the water section of this tank, I've once again kept things nice and simple. It's just a small group of cherry shrimp and some ram's horn snails. It's only a small water section with about 11 litres of water or 3 gallons, so there's not too much else you really want to put in here in the first place. Realistically, with how little time these vampire crabs spend in the water, you could probably put them in a vivarium with small water section, kind of like you do for poison dart frogs, though I do need to experiment with this, so don't quote me on that being viable just yet. Looking at the project after a little over 200 days, and apart from a little bit of plant melt, everything has gone according to plan, and the crabs seem to be doing really well so far. So here's a quick overview of the core components for this project. I'll have everything listed below and over on my website if you're looking for more detailed information. Firstly, I flipped the light to run from left to right and at the front of the tank, rather than running from front to back. This reduced the light spillover, which was creating a bit of glare on my computer screen. I also angled it in a little bit as well. While the water feature is working really well, it's probably more work than it's really worth getting it to this stage. It took a long time to make sure the water flowed exactly where I wanted it to, and in the long run, I probably wouldn't have bothered doing this again in the future. That said, having it along with the fogger makes things look really nice and really natural, so it was certainly worth adding, at least for the beginning phase of this tank. Interestingly as well, I only run the waterfall and the fogger for about 3 hours per day, so 1.5 hours in the morning when the lights are coming on, and again in the afternoon for about 1.5 hours when the lights are going into sunset phase. If I was to make this tank again, I would skip adding the waterfall, and instead I would add 3 or 4 isolated shallow pools somewhere along the tank. I think this would work really well, and especially for this species of vampire crab. I've had them for a while now. I haven't seen them enter the water section at all. All in all, it's been a really fun project, and it was great to work inside the Exoterra. It's a really nice platform to build in. So if you are leaning towards a tank like this, I highly suggest getting one and giving it a go.